Welcome back, Physics 1 students and other random people from the internet. So the purpose of this tutorial is specifically how to show you how to graph using a Mac. Okay, the reason that we made a specific video for graphing on a Mac is because it's a little bit different than the data entry, analysis, and trigonometry. Those ones are going to be exactly the same whether you're running a Windows PC or a Mac PC. Okay, so I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about how I was taught to use Excel, because I think it's probably the way that most people were taught to use Excel. It's what I typically see students doing in the beginning of the semester. So what you were probably taught is if you have two columns of data, right, you highlight your two columns of data, you click Insert, you add your graph, right, and there you have it, right, that's your graph. Now, the reason that I'm going to discourage you from doing this is because you're not as involved in the process, so it can get a little bit confusing which variable ended up on which axis, right? You can do a little, detective work here, and I can hover over my point and I can see it's negative 7.9 comma 8.8. Well, I see that point down here. It's always x comma y, right? So I know this has to be my x variable, this has to be my y variable. But the way that I'm going to show you how to do it, you're not going to have to do any detective work, right? You're going to be able to know right off the bat because you're going to be assigning which variable goes on which axis. The other thing that's great about this too is we're doing D versus T, right? This is the D versus T graph, but we're also doing T versus D, right? So if you're using this technique, then you're going to have to copy your data, right? You're going to have to copy your data like this in the opposite order to highlight it and then do insert and add your scatter plot, right, in order to get the other graph that you needed. So the way that I'm going to show you, you can go ahead and use the original data that we had, okay? So you don't ever have to go through copying and pasting your data in a different order, okay? All right, so without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to click way out in the middle of nowhere, so there's no chance that I'm actually accidentally going to snatch random data. So I click Insert. I'm going to select my scatter plot. We're always going to use this very first one here. If I have clicked far enough out in the middle of nowhere, this chart should be blank. It is, so we can move on to the next step, which is we're going to click Select Data. Now this is what's different about a Mac. The first thing that you have to do is you have to click this plus sign here, okay? That adds your first series to your graph. So we're going to call this D versus T. Now the naming convention when you're naming graphs, it's always Y versus X, okay? Another way that would be perfectly okay to title your graph is to describe your slope. So D versus T, that's Y over X, right, is our slope. That would be speed. So I could also call this speed, but I typically just go with Y versus X because that's never going to fail me. I can't possibly, misinterpret the slope and then completely mislabel my graph, right? So I'm going to encourage you, just do Y versus X. It's the easiest. It always works. Okay, so now that we've gone over that, we're going to pick out our X values, right? So Y versus X, that means T. So we highlight all of our T values over here in the spreadsheet. Now our Y values, that's D, right? So we're going to highlight all of our D values, and then we're going to click OK. You can see now we've got our graph. Next thing we want to do is we want to hit click Quick Layout, and we want this first one right here. So you could probably leave your graph labeled as D versus T. That's perfectly fine. I won't take off points for that as long as you explain what those variables are in your caption. However, I like to write it out, so I'm going to fill in all of my variables. Okay, so on my axis, we want to have what the variable is and the units. So that's going to be distance in meters. And on the x-axis, we're going to have time in seconds. And then the last thing that what I want to do with the layout formatting is because I only have one series on my graph, I'm going to delete this legend. I know that it's D versus T. Okay, if I had more than one series, I would leave it there, but might as well fill up the space with my graph since I know this is the only graph here, D versus T. Okay, so we're going to add the trend line later. Let's do the T versus D graph. So I click out in the middle of nowhere. I click Insert. I'm going to select that first scatter plot again. I've got it blank, which means I clicked far enough out in the middle of nowhere. I click Select Data. I hit my plus sign. Then I do T versus D, okay? Remember, Y versus X. So that means this time my X variable is D. So I'm going to highlight the D values. And then I'm going to highlight my T values for Y. Okay, then I click OK, and there we go. We have T versus D. We add our quick layout. Okay, I'm going to fill in my specific names because that's what I like to do. Then I'm going to give my axes their titles. So this is going to be time in seconds, and this is going to be distance in meters. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this legend. Okay. All right, so the last thing that we need to do here is we need to add our trend line. Well, each graph needs a trend line. So all you need to do is right-click on any of your data points, and you'll get this drop-down menu. You want to select Add Trend Line, and then you're going to want to select Display Equation on Chart. Now you'll notice that I didn't mess with my trend line options. The reason I didn't mess with my trend line options is because this is obviously a linear graph. Okay, the default in Excel is linear. This is a linear graph, so I don't need to change it. However, you do need to be careful in other labs. Your graphs will not always be linear. In lab 2, for example, you're going to be graphing a parabola. Okay, so that's going to be polynomial order 2. Okay, so just make sure that you're using the best fit for your data. All right. Like I said, the default is a line here, and my data is linear, so I don't need to change it. But if you do have a curve, make sure that you're choosing the best fit. All right, so we're done with that. I'm just going to more centrally locate my trend line, and now I'm going to come over here to my time versus distance graph, do the same thing, right-click, add trend line. It's also linear. I'm going to display my equation on chart and move this to a more central location, and then I'm done with these two graphs. Now we're gonna take a minute here and we're gonna do a little bit of a bonus round. So this is not part of the Excel tutorial. This is just sort of FYI because it's helpful for Lab 7 to have seen this before. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna do an example of a graph that has 2 series on it. Okay, so I'm just gonna add another series here. This is gonna be D2 in meters, okay? And my data is just gonna be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay? So what we have here is we have the same timer, but we have 2 different objects, okay, that traveled 2 different distances, okay? Maybe I'll call this guy D1, okay? This object, object 1, traveled D1, and this object, object 2, traveled D2, all right? So just like before, I'm gonna click way out in the middle of nowhere, insert, scatter, click the first scatter plot. I've got a blank chart. So we move on to select data. I'm going to click the plus button. Now I'm going to call this graph D1 versus T. And my X values are going to be my T values. And my Y values are going to be my D1 values. Okay. Now I'm going to click the plus sign again, and I'm going to add a second series to my graph. This one is going to be D2 versus T. All right, again, my X values, those are going to be my T values, and my Y values, those are going to be D2 this time. Okay, now I've added both of my series. I click OK, and now you can see I have a graph that has 2 series on it. I'm going to add a quick layout, and then I'm going to give my chart a name. So that's going to be D versus T. And then my axes titles. So on my y-axis, I have distance in meters. And on my x-axis, I have time in seconds. And then I'm not going to get rid of my legend this time. I'm going to leave my legend there because I have two series, and this way I can tell which one is D1 and which one is D2, right? If I look at my legend, I can see that these blue dots correspond to D1 and that these orange dots correspond to D2. All right, so that was just a bonus round. We don't actually need this. This isn't part of the tutorial, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it. But that's just FYI. It should be helpful for Lab 7, how to put two series on the same graph. But this concludes the graphing portion, part 2 of the Lab 0 Excel tutorial. I will see you for part 3, the analysis section.